Axiom of Choice by Literally Mad Lad on AO3. Episode 17, Chapter 6. Oh, to be a merman along barflies. Katsuki's new legs were functional, if not awkward to stand on. It took several hours for him to stand on two legs the way Deku always did. Straight back, poised, his feet slightly parted. The balancing act was precautious as best. Using the wall for support, Katsuki taught himself to walk. He had observed Deku and the assistant thousands of times before, and each step mimicked the way they walked. It was jerky and uncomfortable at first, but with practice, his steps became smooth and even. His first steps away from the wall were nerve-wracking. It felt like he was suspended above a great height, and to see his home from this vantage point was bizarre. This is what Deku sees, Katsuki thought. He tried the stairs. They creaked under the soles of his feet. Where he approached the door, he gave the handle an experimental tug, but it was locked. Even if he wanted to leave, he couldn't. Katsuki sat on the stairs, his new legs stretched out ahead of him. He ran his hands over his kneecaps, which were flushed and bony beneath his thumbs. Ages ago, Katsuki would ask why Deku couldn't spend more time with him in the water. He had explained once to Kachan that humans couldn't live in the water for long periods of time, otherwise their skin became pruny. The water could wash away sunbloom, which was something that allowed the skin to become waterlogged. The more Katsuki ran his hands up and down his torso, the more the texture started to mimic his new legs. He was loosening the glossy film over his skin that protected it from the water. He couldn't breathe underwater, and while he knew he could still manage to hunt, it would be difficult with his clumsy, grotesque human legs. Katsuki approached the door once more and drove off at the end, the piercing through his water. His hands stretched out and grabbed the fabric of the bottom of the pool, where his makeshift den was. He pulled them up with him. His breath pitched in his chest. He gasped for air on the surface as he slapped the clothes onto the dock to dry. Once the clothes were dry, Katsuki took them on. He had worn Deku's shirts before, and this one was worn down from the water. It was thin and wrinkled, and the pattern had used to be on it dissolved weeks ago. The swim trunks were uncomfortable, but if Deku always wore them, then Katsuki wanted too. And then Katsuki crossed the dam. The lever system they used for the dam wall involved a series of ropes and chains, strung up by wheels attached to the ceiling. One such wheel was close to the riverfall entrance. Katsuki gave the levy chain an experimental tug. The metal was grimy with some black, oily substance, which Katsuki brushed off as his own trunks, with a disgusted sneer. He went to the rope levy on the opposite side of the dam, and detached it from the wheel. He looped it at the end of it and knotted it, and added a second loop slightly tighter, and then another, until he couldn't reach. Part of the rope was submerged in water. Katsuki gave it a firm tug, but the moment he hooked a foot through the rope sunk far from the water tunnel. His knees wobbled, unsteady, and he screamed the instant his foot dropped out of the rope. The rope split the skin under his toe and sneered his palm as he slid down and dropped into the salty water. So much for keeping the clothes dry, he thought as he ran his hands over the underside of his feet. The cut was pretty drastic, all things considered, and upon trying again, it only made the cuts worse. He floated on the surface after several failed attempts to reconsider his options. He could slowly starve to death. He could scale the stone wall. One look at the rock underneath the tunnel, and Katsuki was certain he'd be sustainable more than a cut on the bottom of his feet. He groaned, slapping his arms into the water. He had mapped the cave system better than the back of his own hand. Several kids in the past had investigated every crevice outside the water too, with no avail. There was no way out of here except Deku's door. Katsuki took a deep breath of crisp, cool autumn air and breathed it out. He did so under his heart rate, and it returned to normal. It was then that a memory surfaced. He blinked, staring at the ceiling. The water had lapped up around his cheeks, but it spilled away from the instant he straightened. He swam to one of the corners of the containment pool, the very crevice he used to lie in during the times Deku and the assistant had cleaned the pool. The same crevice with a gap in the very back of it, too narrowed for the meat of his tail to fit through on the first day of his freedom. Katsuki took a deep breath and ducked down. He kicked and thrashed his feet out, his arms pumping him towards the bottom of the cave. His hands grazed the rock, and he hooked them over and propelled himself forwards. His chest felt like a goddamn rock, and the sensation only grew the longer he spent under the surface, reaching through the crevice. His hands had dipped through, and then his shoulders, and his hips weaseled through shortly thereafter. The rocks were frigid as he scraped past them. His knee clucked and clanked through the gap before the tops of his feet scraped along the surface. Katsuki dragged himself forward by his arms. He gripped hold of the edge of the rock, squeezing his shoulders through the narrow passage, before heaving the rest of his body after. Whatever remaining functions he might have had in his skills seemed to be the miracle keeping his lungs from collapsing. He maneuvered up to a slightly larger opening between a collapsed rock and a patch of solid clay. By then, his lungs were screaming, but his stubbornness refuted it. He wouldn't turn back. Not now. An unintentional groan of discomfort squeezed out of him as he crawled beneath the solid block of clay, his foot shoved against the rock behind him, crawling for purchase. That groan, though, sacrificed any remaining air he had in his reserve. His hands floundered forward into nothing. Something crashed into it, with the force of a current. The river. Katsuki gasped out, choking. His lungs spasmed with a lurch in his chest as his hips became snarly with the clay. The heels of his palms dug into the clay, sinking. His face broke the surface, but his lungs were too waterlogged to gasp for air. With a choked cough, the current surged over him, splashing in a haze of white-tipped waves. The clash of waves rippled him forward. His hips popped out from between the clay blocks. The second he broke the surface completely, it was pandemonium. Shit, shit, shit. He grabbed for the nearest rock, but as he did, his legs swung out to the side, useless against the current. His hand slipped, dragging across the mossy surface until a splash of water knocked him over and sent him spiraling away from the edge of the river. He coughed, and all the water he swallowed rippled up his lungs. His stomach crashed into something solid, knocking out whatever air he had managed to recover. His legs swung under it, and the moment he grabbed hold, he recognized it as a rotting tree branch. The bark was slimy with moss and moisture, but he held on. The water barricaded over him, knocking his head under. Katsuki clawed at the branch, his feet swimming through the weeds at the bottom of the riverbed as he went. The branch jerked forward as the bottom half cracked under his weight. He needed to move fast, and the minute the dread crossed his mind, he was already digging his non-existing nails into the dirt. He heaved himself onto the grass, coughing water up as he panted. His legs struggled to catch on, and it took the last remaining upper body strength he had to dig his heels into the grass. He curled his feet up, shivered another cough wrecked through him. Several minutes went by. Katsuki was shaking by the end of it, the breeze splitting through his skin like needles into his bone. He sat up, chest on fire, and rubbed his hands across his face to clear his vision. Okay, alright. We're here. Katsuki has, I wouldn't say escaped, because it seems like he's probably gonna go back, like, with Deku. There's literally no way he's motherfucker's escaping. But I wonder why Katsuki has turned into a human. That's something that I wondered in the last one as well, but, like, I'm wondering it now a lot more. Because now that I think about it, now that I had a second for it to process, or not a second, but, like, now that it's processed, you know, what did the black tail have to do with it? Because I thought maybe it was the maturity thing, the, you know, that type of maturity, but no, maybe it could have been this. I still don't see what purpose. I mean, it would explain why mermaids are not found and haven't been found and barely now have been found. It's because they hide among us. Oh my god, among us. Anyways, that's just my theory. As always, Mary and Josh, make sure to eat, sleep, drink water, take your meds. Have a wonderful day or night. Link to my Discord server and socials are down in the description. Subscribe to see more of my content, and thank you so much for watching.